Good afternoon. I want to call this hearing to order, and I want to welcome to our non-government expert witnesses, although at least two have served with distinction in the government. Let me start with the Honorable Bill Evanina, former director of the National Counterintelligence and Security Center. He's also the founder and CEO of the Evanina Group. The Honorable Michelle Van Cleave, senior advisor, Jack Kemp Foundation, and again, former National Counterintelligence executive at the Office of Director of National Intelligence. Dr. Kevin Gamache, who is the Vice Chancellor and Chief Research Officer at Texas A&M University System. And Mr. Robert Sheldon, the Director of Public Policy and Strategy at CrowdStrike. Today's hearing, Protecting American Innovation, Industry, Academia, and the National Counterintelligence Security Center, will examine the implications of the findings of our committee's bipartisan report on the NCIX, which we publicly released yesterday. This is the first in a series of hearings on the report, and future hearings will include current U.S. counterintelligence officials to discuss in more depth concrete changes that may be necessary for the NCIX and the government's counterintelligence enterprise. I think we all understand that the traditional model of intelligence that kind of evolved post-World War II, and in many cases in our country and countries like the UK evolved a long time earlier, but particularly post-World War II, where we, the Brits, the Russians, had a series of espionage agents, oftentimes working out of an embassy and basically trying to discover information or secrets about a foreign adversary. That classic spy versus spy model is pretty much in the historic dustbins at this point. And as I think we know, our nation now faces a dramatically different threat landscape than it did even a couple of decades ago. Today's foreign intelligence threats are not just obviously targeting the government, but are increasingly looking at the private sector to gain technological edge over our industries. One of the remarkable statistics is as much as $600 billion a year of intellectual property is stolen each year from the United States. And that doesn't even count what's stolen from some of our allies and partners around the world. New threats and new technologies mean that we need to make serious and substantive adjustments to how we address the issue of counterintelligence if we are to protect America's national and economic security. For many years, members of this committee were constantly hearing the alarm bell ringing when we got briefings on these foreign intelligence threats. But you felt it was important not just to be made aware of that threat, but to also do something about it. So I want to thank Senator Rubio, Senator Cornyn, I think Senator Cotton appeared, a number of members on my side of the aisle, where we went out and literally, oftentimes with Bill Evanina, did what we called was a series of classified roadshows. To focus particularly on the challenge and non-traditional means of espionage put forward by the PRC. We did that with tech companies, we did it with VCs, we did it in academia, again, to really look at the challenge presented by the CCP and the leadership of Xi Jinping. As I mentioned, we did aerospace, advanced manufacturing, AI, biotech, data analytics, a whole host of areas where we are now engaged in a tremendous competition. We started to take action on that competition. I'm proud of the fact that in a broadly bipartisan way, there is now a law to make sure that we can bring part of that semiconductor industry back to the United States. My belief is there may be other technology domains where we have to make similar investments because clearly, we know that the CCP is making these investments. I was an old telecom guy, and it was more than stunning to me when it became aware that not only had the PRC suddenly obtained the leading international company in 5G in the form of Huawei, but that they were also setting the rules, standards, and protocols for that emerging technology. Again, FBI Director Wray has stated the Bureau literally opens up a new PRC-related counterintelligence investigation every 10 hours. thousands of these cases that are open. And that China has stolen more American personal and corporate data than, frankly, every other nation in the world combined. With this hearing, we are broadening our counterintelligence focus to also look at the malign role played by other large state adversaries like Russia, as well as Iran, North Korea, and other states who wish us well. As we discuss what the CCP in particular is doing in the United States, I want to make myself crystal clear that my concern lies squarely with Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party, not the people of China, and certainly not with Chinese or Asian Americans or any parts of the Chinese diaspora anywhere in the world. But in fact, failure to make that distinction oftentimes will play right into the CCP's propaganda agenda. And many times it is Chinese Americans who are often the victim of the CCP's intelligence service activities. Similarly, we've recently seen those brave Russians who came out some level of force to protest against Vladimir Putin's war. And we saw the subsequent arrest of the opposition leader, Navalny. Again, our beef is not with the Russian people or immigrants of Russian descent, but with the kleptocratic and murderous regime of Vladimir Putin. The committee's report is the product of years of independent research by nonpartisan committee staff to assess the mission, authorities, and resourcing of the NCIX and its mission to coordinate the government's counterintelligence efforts. Among the report's findings are, one, that the United States faces threats from a wide variety of adversaries, including powerful state rivals such as China and Russia, regional adversaries, minor states, and these organizations that play out these entities' operations, oftentimes not simply within the traditional spy services. Foreign intelligence entities are targeting a wide set of public and private entities, including U.S. government departments and agencies that are not part of the intelligence community and not part of our national labs or other traditional sources, but they are going after the financial sector, our energy sector, and again, lots of folks in the industrial base and academia. Today's adversaries have access to a much wider variety of tools for stealing information, influencing U.S. officials, or inflaming social and political tensions than in the past, including non-traditional human, cyber, advanced technical, and other source intelligence operations to collect against U.S. plans and policies, sensitive technology, and personally identifiable information. How we make sure we protect that, as well as our intellectual product in this country, is part of our responsibility in this committee. Despite the wide-ranging and sophisticated number of counterintelligence threats facing the U.S., the United States counterintelligence enterprise is not postured to confront the whole of society threat facing the country today. And with the NCSC lacking a clear mission, as well as sufficient and well-defined authorities and resources to effectively deal with this. Now, I'd love to say that the report came up with a series of specific recommendations. It did not. I think they posed a number of the problems, but this hearing and others is how we get at this issue, and we clearly have folks who played from inside the government role on the IC side and outside experts as well. So the core questions for this hearing are, what role should academia and industry play in protecting information with national security implications? Are there legislative or policy changes needed to codify that role? What government resources may be needed to help academia and industry protect their data, technologies, and people? And what role is the NCSC, as the lead agency for national counterintelligence, expected to play in informing and coordinating with all of these entities? And given the increasingly important role of counterintelligence due to the threats from these foreign governments, and I think I have some real questions about this, I know, but the report posited the question, does the U.S. government need an independent counterintelligence agency to tackle them? I have some doubts about that. While no consensus I mentioned has been raised, we're going to look at this problem in I think a comprehensive way, and we welcome not only the panel but others' input into this determination. The truth is, the intelligence traditions have changed dramatically from the post-war era, from the Cold War era. We are engaged, particularly with the PRC, but with others as well, a technology competition that will define who becomes the security and economic leader of the 21st century. It's my hope that America maintains that leadership role. But to do that, we've got to have an effective counterintelligence operation. And with that, I turn to my friend, the Vice Chairman.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for coming here today. I think you've covered most of it, and I think our audits and projects team has done a good job of sort of identifying the problem. And part of these hearings is now to begin to think through what some of the things that we can do from our end to either mandate or provide a pathway towards solutions. The core problem is this, and you've stated it well, and the sort of way I would describe it in general is our entire system is set up for an era in which counterintelligence, basically espionage, was governments trying to steal government secrets, getting into the Defense Department, learning about things that have to do with, nation-state proprietary information and classified information. And we're now in an era in which the activities of intelligence agencies from around the world come from a variety of countries with different intentions, and they range from cyber intrusions designed to both steal secrets and also to generate revenue, to disinformation and misinformation to try to steer and influence and shape American policy and divide us and distract us or debilitate us, to obviously academia, both because they're interested in the research, but frankly, in many cases, to try to influence students. It's a long-range plan to look at someone who's 20 years old today and say, we can shape their narrative about China and Taiwan, or China and Tibet, or China and Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. Today, 20 years from now, these individuals will be running companies or key agencies in government, and maybe even elected, and that will help us. This is a multifaceted, new era type challenge, which our agencies simply weren't created to function. And they were created in an era where there wasn't great power competition, where the number of nations around the world that had the capability to even do intelligence operations against the United States domestically, not to mention globally, was much smaller than it is today. So really the hope here today is to understand how we can help clarify the mission, particularly of the National Counterintelligence and Security Center, the NCIX. So how we can give it a clear mission that captures the full array of challenges, provide them with well-defined authorities that allow them to do that, and then understand whether or not we're providing sufficient resources to be able to carry that out. And those three things, having the clear mission, having the authorities to carry out the mission, and having the resources to carry out that mission are the path forward. But it really begins with understanding a clear mission as to what it entails and all the intricacies and complications that would come with that. So all of you have been involved in different ways with this, and we're grateful you come in today to help us begin to chart the way forward.
And thank you, Vice Chairman Rubio. I'm again proud of the staff work that put together this report. Again, it follows in the tradition of this committee, is that we do things bipartisan, and I think this at least gives a roadmap of what some of the issues are. And now we're looking to sort through what the answer should be. So we're going to start, Bill, with you, and we're going to go left to right down the panel.
Chairman Warner, Vice Chairman Rubio, members of the committee, it's a pleasure, humbled to be back here in front of you in this committee, especially with an esteemed panel of experts here today. I want to first thank the committee and the members of the committee for your continued leadership and commitment to the intelligence community, law enforcement, and the dedicated women and men around the globe keeping us safe and free. Our enduring democracy and unsurpassed economy, along with the best military in the history of the world, affords us with fundamental and unparalleled freedom and security. Protecting those freedoms and security are, in some part, due to those dedicated women and men serving in the counterintelligence arena. However, their job has never been more difficult than it is today. The threat landscape has dramatically expanded in the past decade, specifically with the counterintelligence battle space transitioning to the private sector, especially with respect to the Communist Party of China. The past decade has also provided us with a very clear mosaic of the modernization of the nation-state threat actors conducting persistent, strategic, and sometimes destructive cyber attacks on American government agencies, corporations, and academic institutions. Their data, their systems, and their employees have all been targeted. Strategically placed insiders and cyber penetrations are the most commonly utilized modalities of the Communist Party of China. With 21st century asymmetric threats increasing exponentially, it is time to take an honest, modern, and reimagined view of counterintelligence. Counterintelligence is not just catching spies or insiders from adversarial countries, but also It is a key defense mechanism of our nation's key source of strength and posterity, our economy. We must also approach counterintelligence with the same sense of urgency, spending, and strategy we have done for the past 2 decades in preventing terrorism. I would offer to this committee that we are in a terrorism event, a slow, methodical, strategic, persistent, and enduring event which requires a degree of urgency of action. As much as counterintelligence investigations, strategy, and policy are inherently government functions and responsibilities, U.S. corporations, research institutions, non-Title 50 organizations, and academia must become a larger part of the process of protecting their own proprietary data, trade secrets, and fundamental research. China and others are attempting every day to take what they ideate and develop. This is especially true when such organizations receive federal grants and funding. Currently prescient is the passage of the CHIPS and Science Act, as well as the Inflation Reduction Act. Rest assured, China has already begun their strategic and comprehensive efforts to acquire, both legally and illegally, any and all ideation, research, and trade secrets emanating from the existing and extensive funding provisions and technological incentives provided by these legislative actions. I would offer emerging renewable energy technologies and semiconductor production will be targeted the most aggressively by China. From a counterintelligence perspective, where does this protection responsibility reside? This is a counterintelligence issue. 10 years from now, this committee cannot be holding hearings and asking how China stole our federally funded and subsidized capabilities and secrets and progress, and then selling them back to us as customers. I would like to close by acknowledging that defending our nation, especially in the counterintelligence arena, has become complicated and encompassing. However, I would be remiss if I did not mention the United States possesses the finest offensive capabilities and counterintelligence personnel the world has ever seen. As this committee is fully aware, their dedication, their successes are impactful, they're enduring, and they properly remain silent. Our nation is grateful. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today, and I look forward to your questions.
Mr. Chairman, Vice Chairman Rubio, members of the committee, let me begin by echoing the praise that my colleague Bill has just iterated for our counterintelligence professionals. It was my honor to have served as the Director of Senate Security from 2020 to 2021, so I feel warmly at home appearing before you here today. I was also deeply honored when President George W. Bush appointed me the first statutory head of U.S. counterintelligence. That position, as you know, was created by the Counterintelligence Enhancement Act of 2002, which was, as it happens, voted out of committee 20 years ago next week. Voted out of the Senate, rather, 20 years ago next week, under the careful leadership of this committee. I believe that your leadership is sorely needed again. Mr. Chairman, to that end, I've prepared a written statement which I hope may be of help to you, and I ask that it be included in the record. Foreign powers use their intelligence capabilities to advance their goals and to prejudice ours. In today's volatile geopolitical environment, their operations are intensifying against us, not waning. Russia's war on Ukraine has changed everything, setting the stage for what President Biden has called a battle between democracy and autocracy. Having lived through the events of January 6th with all of you, I am acutely aware of the lines of fragility in our democracy, which foreign powers have and will continue to seek to exploit. The bottom line I would offer is this: the core counterintelligence mission to identify, assess, and defeat foreign intelligence operations has never been more crucial to U.S. national security. Protective security plans and programs, to be sure, are profoundly important, and I have little doubt that we are all agreed on that point. But they will never be enough. In my view, the United States cannot afford to cede the initiative to those who are working against us. The stakes are too high. Indeed, the old wisdom is still true. The best defense is a good offense. But unfortunately, our counterintelligence enterprise has never been configured to be able to preempt. Preemption requires strategic national planning and coordinated operations against foreign intelligence threats. By contrast, our CI agencies have very distinct and separate missions, and they operate within their own lanes, and each is very good at what they do, but as experience has shown, that is not enough. These are the very deficiencies that the CI Enhancement Act of 2002 intended to correct. However, while the law back then created a national CI mission to integrate CI activities, it did not create the means by which that could be carried out. So the first national counterintelligence strategy, which was issued by President Bush, called for creating a strategic CI capability to proactively disrupt foreign intelligence threats, starting with working the target abroad. Where are they situated? How do they recruit? Who are their personnels? What are their liaison surfaces? How are they tasked? What are their vulnerabilities? How can those vulnerabilities be exploited? There was a pilot program to do that on a select high-priority target that was started under my watch with congressional support, but it was quietly terminated after I left. Subsequent national counterintelligence strategies have omitted this key goal altogether, and the national office has moved on to do other things. So we've been stuck in neutral for 20 years. To date, neither strategic counterintelligence nor a strategic CI program is defined in law or anywhere else. The very concept of a national counterintelligence mission, different from what the operating arms are already doing, was and remains new and untested. Without the discipline of a national program, our CI management will continue to measure performance against the individual agency metrics for which they are accountable, as they must. But is that enough to counter the foreign intelligence threats directed against the United States? I fear that scorecard may be very much in doubt, which I hope the committee will choose to explore in greater detail as part of your much-needed oversight of U.S. counterintelligence and this series of hearings. As for the national mission and office, I think this committee had it right 20 years ago. The challenge still remains how to pull together a strategic counterintelligence program. One team, one plan, one goal. Your leadership and some carefully crafted, clarifying amendments to that 20-year-old law could make all the difference. I look forward to your questions.
I think you've got to turn your mic on.
Start again. Chairman Warner, Vice Chairman Rubio, Senator Cornyn, and members of the committee, thanks for the opportunity to testify before you today.
We noted that special Texas shout-out you gave.
I'm the Chief Research Security Officer for the Texas A&M University System and come today to discuss the unique challenges universities face in protecting cutting-edge U.S. research. With 4 decades protecting our national security, first as an Air Force nuclear operations and maintenance officer, for 14 years in my current position, and as a faculty member at Texas A&M, I'm glad to have the opportunity to bring these perspectives to this critical issue. One of the primary roles universities play is the free and open generation and dissemination of knowledge. The collaborative nature of the U.S. research enterprise is a prime source of discovery and innovation. International collaboration is crucial to scientific advancement and the success of U.S. research institutions. American universities are a magnet for students and researchers worldwide to join forces to advance science and solve our most pressing problems. Unfortunately, we're not playing on a level field. Our technological leadership is under siege from countries like Russia, China, Iran, and others whose rules for research integrity differ from ours. I'd like to highlight a few organizational and process changes we've implemented to address this significant threat. A&M Chancellor John Sharp established the Research Security Office at the system level in 2016 to provide program management and oversight of sensitive research across the 19 A&M system members. We require mandatory disclosure of all foreign collaborations and approval of foreign travel. We conduct continuous network monitoring using techniques explicitly focused on identifying malign foreign actors. We updated our conflict of interest and commitment policies and established processes for reviewing and approving collaborations and agreements. We established a secure computing enclave that is available system-wide to protect system federally funded research. Understanding our collaborators and their funders is the most critical aspect of our research security program. It is equally important to know if a foreign government nexus exists and the risk it poses to the institution. We must also understand whether these risks can be mitigated or must be eliminated. We use a robust, open-source, risk-based due diligence process to review visiting scholars and postdoctoral researchers to answer these questions. You may have heard it said, we can't arrest our way out of this problem. We agree and have developed strong relationships with the FBI, DCSA, and other IC members to address issues promptly. Federal level opportunities to significantly impact the problem also exist. A National Research Security Center of Excellence in academia working with the FBI, DCSA, and other agencies to coordinate the flow of counterintelligence information between academia, law enforcement, and the intelligence community would enhance efficiency and effectiveness. Secondly, our adversaries would be less effective if U.S. faculty and students were resourced more fully through enhanced federal research funding. Top international scholars in our universities enhance innovation and knowledge, but also prevent risks. Partnering with federal agencies to mitigate existing and emerging threats, educate our researchers, and provide clear avenues to address security concerns are crucial. Doing so will allow the U.S. Academy to continue producing game-changing research and a skilled workforce and ensure U.S. technological and economic security. Thank you for the opportunity to testify. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Mr. Sheldon?
Chairman Warner, Vice Chairman Rubio, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. Innovation is an essential theme of the American story.
Your mic a little bit closer, too, please.
Sure. Innovation is an essential theme of the American story. While the private sector is not the sole source of innovation in the country, it plays the leading role in making new innovations accessible to everyone. The private sector is incredibly diverse. When explaining CrowdStrike perspectives to the policy community, I mentioned that we protect 15 of the top 20 U.S. banks and a significant and growing portion of the U.S.gov. But given the nature of the hearing today, I also want to emphasize that we protect small organizations from family-owned farms to cutting-edge startups. Cyber threats have devastating consequences for families, communities, and the economy. In the aggregate, these consequences extend to national security. I'm honored to share some insights from our work across government and industry and identify some areas where we, as a nation, can strengthen cybersecurity outcomes. Today, the private sector faces a punishing array of cyber threats. CrowdStrike research published this month identified campaigns targeting 37 distinct industries and a 50% increase in interactive intrusions over the past year. Regarding nation states, China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea present the most potent threats. States utilize cyber means for espionage, theft, extortion, coercion, disruption, destruction, and subversion. I've provided more detail on these threats in my written testimony, but here I want to cite intellectual property theft and supply chain attacks as key concerns for national resilience. Different segments of the private sector have different needs, constraints, and capacities to defend against cyber attacks. Organizations with cybersecurity mandates have proliferated in recent years, but victims still struggle to know who to contact for what types of issues. Sometimes lost is a fundamental reality of the cybersecurity landscape. When a private company is the victim of a cyber attack and it cannot remediate the issue independently, it must turn to a private sector incident response provider. There is no U.S. government agency that has the authorities and capabilities to provide end-to-end cybersecurity services from hunting to remediation at scale. As you consider options to clarify and strengthen NCSC roles and missions, please consider 2 points. First, in some cases, significant IC information can be shared without impacting sources and methods. Government disclosures this year regarding Russian plans and intentions for Ukraine, including warnings about specific disinformation themes and advisories about specific cyber threats, were very well received by industry. Second, NCSC should endeavor to operate at scale. This probably means a preference for leveraging existing government structures like JCDC and commercial service providers with significant reach. During my time at CrowdStrike, some of the most impactful changes I've seen have involved the advent of groundbreaking managed threat hunting services and broader managed security services. These provide a reliable, consistently high degree of protection 24/7 by 365, and it's worth exploring opportunities to make such services more widely available. It's further worth considering additional programs or efforts to make available concrete cybersecurity services. As a community, we should undertake a more serious conversation about expanding national incident response capacity. A program that retains skilled providers in advance for use during significant cyber incidents could expand the cybersecurity workforce and strengthen national resilience. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to your questions.
I want to thank the panel for their questions. There will be a second vote at some point. We're going to work through that vote, and unlike our normal process where we do seniority at the gavel, in our public hearings we do straight seniority, so we'll do 5-minute rounds. My first one is for the panel. It's a two-part question. One of the things that this committee took on after literally years of having almost weekly and sometimes bi-weekly briefs around the threats posed by the CCP was, it seemed like we were existing in two parallel worlds. We were hearing all these threats and concerns, and yet the economic and message that was going on is the more we partner with China, the better. The more we bring China into the global world order, the more that we're going to have similar systems. Starting back in 2017, we on a again, bipartisan basis, started going out, and Bill, you were involved in a number of these, and I want to thank all my colleagues who participated, and did a series of classified briefings for industry sector after industry sector. And the disconnect between what we were hearing in the intelligence briefings and what they were kind of being told by Wall Street, or in terms of academic exchanges or academic freedom, was night and day. And some of those were challenging sessions. I remember, Dr. Maj, I'm glad to hear your comments about what you started doing in 2019, but the number of universities that had no idea about, somehow professors getting all expense paid trips to lecture in China and not thinking about even preconditions like maybe you ought to not bring your laptop along, were pretty chilling. We've done close to 20 of these. We did a number of them before COVID. Post-COVID, we've seen a great tick-up, and I want to thank academia for improving. And I think we have started to reach some ideas around consensus. Again, a lot of us on this committee led the effort to try to put in place a cyber incident reporting requirement. But the question I have, and I'm going to break it into three categories, kind of non-Intel U.S. government and state government and local government entities, academia, and then private enterprises, with, assuming you've got a continuum that, at least in terms of government, there ought to be higher standards. Are there standards, legal, moral? What are the role of informing those three entities about the threat? And should there be, should we just rely on best practices in terms of academic protections? Should we put in jeopardy federal funding? We have started on cyber incident reporting. I think there's a greater recognition. Certain, obviously, more regulated industries have standards, but cross-cutting standards we still lack. So again, I think I'll go down the list the same way we started. If you could want to comment briefly on all three of those categories and whether there should be simply moral challenges, legal, or standards. I know Senator Cornyn and Senator Casey's got some legislation about investing, but let's take those three areas, legal, moral, and standard setting, and each of those three subsets. Bill.
Thank you, Senator. A really difficult question, and I think that gets to the crux of where we are in today's battle in this gray area of even from open research to private sector to our adversaries. I think when you look at your question, I think Texas A&M should be commended for what they've done and what Dr. Marsh has done in the last few years in setting a standard with others in the academic community from a compliance perspective. And I would proffer they do more than 95% of the other academic institutions and research institutions do. And I think setting at least a minimum standard would be great from what using Texas A&M as a model. But I'd also proffer to you on the state, local, and federal government and non-Title 50s don't do anywhere near what Texas A&M does, specifically with their federal funding and subsidies they give to research institutions. So I think there is a baseline to start with, and I would make it analogous to the idea of the Internet of Things. If we don't start with the baseline fundamental security apparatus, we're never going to get to a utopia state of having the right structural organization authorities. But understanding the problem is phase number one, and I think commend this committee, yourself, and Senator Rubio and Senator Burr and others for those roadshows because they were influential to the people who drive our national economy for making them understand the complexities and the global engagement and economic well-being and dealing with China. At the same time, their role and responsibility in protecting our nation and what they do.
Mr. Chairman, what you've described is no small challenge to the country, to our business and industry, to academia. Can't hear me? Sorry. That's no small challenge, but I would offer that it is, while the scale and magnitude of what we're facing today is staggering, it's not entirely new in the way the United States has had to deal with threats to our business and industry. And I recall being then in the Bush 41 White House, working in the science office for the president, when the wall came down and everything changed, and globalization meant that there was a great more commerce and interaction and movement of people. And our immediate concern was, so we're going to find that the U.S. R&D and S&T base is now going to be raided all the more by foreign actors who are exfiltrating IT and technology and everything to their own benefit. So back then, I remember my first interaction with working with the FBI. They were setting up at the time something called the National Security Threat List when they were trying to understand what things might be targeted by business and industry. Well, fast forward, and I think that we have a continuing need for providing awareness. The counterintelligence world gains the insights into what these foreign intelligence services are doing and how they're doing it against us. and foreign intelligence services and beyond, using other instruments beyond their intelligence community to acquire and target our IT and our proprietary information. And those relationships that the FBI has established, I think, they're working very hard. They've created a national CI task force and task forces within all of the 56 field offices to build upon the relationships that they have with business and industry to try and do outreach with them. And I do think we need to be doing as much of that as possible. But I would offer that first we have to have the insights. And first, we have to understand what the foreign intelligence services in other countries are doing against us. In order to have those insights, we're turning to our counterintelligence world, hardcore CI, going out and learning how these services are operating against us so that we can better protect ourselves and stop them.
Thank you. Dr. Gamache?
I'd like to say that from what I see in academia, things have greatly changed over the last 5 years. The level of awareness, I think, is definitely heightened over what it was 5 years ago. But that's not good enough. We've come a long way. The awareness level is greatly enhanced, but we've got a long way to go. I think NSPM 33 is a great start, but it's probably not enough in terms of providing direction and creating avenues for awareness that don't exist right now. Helping academia understand how to address the threat once they become aware of it, and having a structure to partner with federal agencies. Right now it's a pickup game. I think increasing the level of awareness in academia, providing guidance on how to address the threat, and then creating a structure to partner with federal agencies in a consistent manner is important.
Thank you. Mr. Sheldon?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Awareness of the threat is important. There are a chorus of people in town who frequently will remind people that there is a cyber threat. It is very significant. People should do basic things like increase hygiene on their networks, do things that are best practices like use multi-factor authentication, and that will only ever get us so far. I think that there's a couple ways that we can incentivize organizations to move more quickly to provide defense for themselves. Those include some of the more regulatory options that we're exploring right now as a community. I think that this committee was instrumental in starting off the conversation around incident reporting, and we'll see how that shapes out at CISA, but certainly there's a lot of good progress been made toward that, and that looks like it will be able to empower CISA to be able to make more assessments about how they can improve mitigations for particularly industries that are targeted within the same sector. The other part of the conversation from our point of view is being able to start having more detailed plans for making resources more broadly available to the most vulnerable organizations, because for folks that are Fortune 500 companies, for example, very frequently they have robust security programs and they're doing what can be done to stop the threat that they're facing. But there's a lot of small and medium-sized businesses that are being left behind for lack of resources, and it's not, the problem isn't exactly lack of awareness. Thank you.
Thank you all. I'm sure we're going to come back and revisit. And second vote has started, but Senator Rubio.
Yeah, and I'm going to shorten my questions. I guess the first, Mr. Evanina, going back to your time in service, if you were to go back and sort of reanalyze some of the authorities and/or mission that you wish had been clearly delineated, what would those have been given the new threat landscape that we've described here already?
Senator Rubio, I think when looking back at the 6+ years I spent there, a lot of the success the NCIC had was predicated upon a few things. Partnership with the other intelligence agencies and some of the non-Title 50 agencies, and a spirit of trust. Lack of duplicity, ensuring that we did not do the same type of analysis and operational work as any other agency, and we were not operational. But thirdly, I think the demand signal that we got from the private sector and others about what is the threat and how it's manifesting. And I think when we look at the other agencies in that space, their job is operational, OCONUS and CONUS. And NCIC took that ball and ran with the policy and strategy part of it. I think the hardship that you're talking about now would be, and to Michelle's point, the lack of clarity in the legislation and the Enhancement Act about legitimate authorities and roles. And I think that would be one thing, starting all over again, a reunification of that act and what those roles, responsibilities are, beyond being the strategy policy organization.
I mean, I think one of the hardest things to do today is to go to someone in public life or a public figure and say, you know, these individuals that you think they're your friends, these individuals that are business people, these individuals that claim to be, you know, that are former politicians or claim to be journalists, are actually being sent here. They may not even know it, to sort of influence the things you're writing, saying, or repeating. It's a real complicated, the disinformation piece is really complicated because sometimes people think they're getting verifiable information, they think they have a scoop, or they just want to say something relevant, and it's hard to distinguish. That's just not the way we think of foreign intelligence operating, especially if they're using multiple cutouts to get to that stage, and that's one we're going to be struggling with for some time. Mr. Sheldon, on the challenge that I know with cyber in general, we often think about it as ransomware and things of that nature, but one of the hardest things to do is to convince small to mid-size companies that they are targets, that these people even know they exist. And so some North Korean cyber actor, a Russian cyber actor that wants to hold you ransom, that's certainly a threat, and that's one thing. But there are some that are systemically important because somewhere along the supply chain or somewhere along the influence chain or somewhere along any of these chains, even though they're a small or mid-sized company, they're important, or they could create regional havoc. What do you think has been what are the things we can be doing to, in the way we stand up this function, to better convince small to mid-sized businesses and entities that they could become a target? They're not anonymous. Just because they're not Boeing or whatever doesn't mean they're not systemically important at the right time for the right reason.
Thank you, Vice Chairman. This is indeed one of the biggest problems from my point of view. There are still some organizations that need to be persuaded that they are a target, but we've seen so much progress over the past few years as collectively as an industry, academia, folks in government, including Mr. Evanina and his colleagues, have gone out and done roadshows, talked with folks in industry to try and flag this problem for them. The other piece of the problem is maybe someone's persuaded that they will be a target, and it's just a matter of resourcing the right types of tools, technologies, processes, and getting the right talent and people to be able to face the threat. From that standpoint, there's been some really significant progress over the past number of years about managed services that I think are really helping to solve this problem for people that are exploring that pathway. If you're a small company, a dozen people or 20 people or even less than 100 people, it's very difficult to have that 24/7/365 security team that can handle an intrusion. So a lot of people are saying, let's partner with an outside provider who can provide some of those things, and that helps particularly small organizations. So those are some capabilities that we think are driving improvement in the area.
Senator Feinstein.
Just very quickly, how do you see that the foreign intelligence landscape threat has changed since Congress last substantially updated U.S. laws in 2002? And what gaps have these changes exposed in the way that the IC views the CI mission? Whoever would like to take it.
Senator, if I'd be happy to leap into that one. In 2002, when the act was first passed, you'll recall that the country was in the middle of a horrible war. And this new office was stood up for the purpose of trying to deal with foreign intelligence threats at a time when most of the national security leadership of the country was seized, and rightly so, with the problem of countering terrorist organizations. Subsequent to that time, we've seen some changes in the national security focus, but what in fact happened back then is that the counterintelligence resources that had previously been available to deal with these foreign intelligence services were slewed over to work the counterterrorism problem. And that is in the face of having a big drawdown at the end of what we thought was the end of the Cold War, of those resources then again moved. So if you were to look today at what
How do you see that changing?
So what I see is that we've had a change here in CI and the devotion of our resources to the mission, but at the same time, the foreign intelligence threat has continued to be very aggressive, very persistent, very fruitful from their perspective, and certainly most recently, the expansion into malign influence operations is something that is really, I think, of very serious concern to our country and society and to our government and everyone.
Do you see this as progress or not? Or the opposite?
Progress by the bad guys or by us? So I think the bad guys, in fact, are making progress because we're stretched so very thin to try to deal with threats that they present to us. And I think that our open society as for a bit of a candy store for them, and they're here in force. And I do think that they will continue to use those intelligence capabilities in order to advance their interests. I'm speaking specifically now with Russia and whatever it means for its future, and certainly China, and there are obviously others. But it's a very serious concern, and we need to take it seriously and respond appropriately.
Well, let me ask this question. Should the statutory definition of CI be updated?
I think the statutory definition of CI is sufficiently understood and broad to be where we need it to be. Where I would love to see some new legislative language is on the very question of what is strategic counterintelligence.
Anybody else on that question?
Senator, to answer both your questions, what I think are the fundamental basis for this committee's hearing today. I think when we look at the Counterintelligence Enhancement Act,
Louder.
The Counterintelligence Enhancement Act of 2002, a couple things were there. It was predicated solely upon spies. The Hansen and Ames reaction of the Russians penetrating our government entities. And I think that was the premise for the act and the counterintelligence mission. That has completely changed now. The landscape is completely asymmetric. We are less concerned about those government-to-government spies. And the battle space is now in the private sector, and it is mostly China. So we have changed not only the actors, but the way they act here in the nation. Secondarily, 2002, we were just in the early stages of the internet. So with the advent of the internet and the ability to scale cyber capabilities at will for adversaries puts, I think, the counterintelligence threat in a new lexicon that has to include cyber.
Anybody else on that question, quickly? No? Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Collins.
Thank you. Dr. Gamache, in your testimony, you talked about efforts that Texas A&M has taken to try to secure its academic research. In your written testimony, you listed conflict of commitment, financial conflict of interest, external employment, and international travel policies as having important research security implications. And I certainly agree with you. Unfortunately, not every academic institution is as advanced as Texas A&M in having well thought out policies and reporting requirements governing those potential vulnerabilities. Do you think that the federal government, as a condition for federal funding for research, should require an institution to adopt policies similar to those that Texas A&M has?
As I stated in my my opening remarks, I think NSPM 33 is a start in that direction. I think academia is moving in that direction on its own, from what I see. But I think there should be some guidance on, what is important to protect and how we do that from a federal level.
My experience is that academia tends to move very slowly. And we've seen that with the Confucius Institutes, for example, and how long it took colleges and universities to break their connections. Mr. Sheldon, do you have any comments in this area as well?
Thank you, Senator. In my spare time, I'm a professor at a university here in DC, American University, and I know that this is, just based on that experience, I know that this is something that universities take very seriously. I mentioned previously that with respect to the cyber threat, it may not be enough to just enumerate best practices if those best practices at this point are widely known. I think I would defer to Dr. Gamache about whether all universities that are in receipt of federal funds have a clear understanding of those best practices, or whether there's some scope for a committee or another effort of some kind to outline what those would be before making more fulsome requirements of potential recipients.
Let me be clear that I think many colleges and universities do understand the threat, are concerned, and are starting to adopt policies that are similar to Texas A&M. And the chairman has done yeoman's work with our ranking member, our vice chair, in trying to educate academia about the threat and the private sector about the threat. But my experience is that it's been sort of this push and pull, this tugging to try to get the seriousness of the threat recognized and precautions put in place. Mr. Chairman, I do need to go vote, and I know you do also, so I'm going to forego a second question and just ask if either of our other two witnesses has any advice to the committee in this area. Ms. Van Cleave, why don't you go first? Could turn on your mic.
I don't really have anything more to add to what was just been said. Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Collins, I'd like to add in Dr. Gamache's perspective on SPM 33. I think it is a good start, and I do think this committee in Congress from a legislative body should consider regulatory action to at least have a bare-bone minimum, especially starting with federal-funded facilities that are using U.S. taxpayer dollars to perform research that is oftentimes targeted by adversaries.
Yeah, I'm thinking, for example, of our national labs, which are likely to have far better security than many institutions. But thank you.
Thank you. Senator Collins. Senator Wyden.
Mr. Chairman, I voted, and I think, have you voted already, Senator Bennett?
I have, but I would love to do what you need to do, but
You sure? I mean, if you're.
Would you mind yielding to Senator Bennett, let him get it?
Then if I could follow him.
Yeah, and then you'll follow.
Great.
quick, thank you very much, Senator Wyden. I deeply appreciate it. Thank you for being here today. I mean, one of the things I think is so important, Mr. Chairman, to have these hearings in public is so the American people can understand what some of you have described as the lack of symmetry that exists between, the United States and open democracy and our adversaries who are surveillance states, and as the chairman said, through no fault of the people that live in these countries. But it would be hard to describe two societies as different as the United States and China is today, and what it means, to our counterintelligence mission and their counterintelligence mission, to our intelligence mission and to their intelligence mission. There's almost no degree of symmetry. I'm going to not ask that, but if you want to comment on that, I'd be curious about what you think. We have had a generation of American politicians before us who had said, just wait, you'll see what happens when the internet gets to China. They're going to democratize. They're going to democratize. Like we were saying the same thing about trade as well. And it turns out that almost nothing that we said around in those think tanks or from these podiums turned out to be real. It was the opposite. I mean, China's Beijing has been able to export its surveillance state as a result of internet technology and technology generally. And I wonder, given that backdrop or that sort of set of observations, whether you could talk a little bit, I'm coming at Senator Collins' question a slightly different way, whether you could talk about what it would look like over the next decade if we actually were getting our act together here, if we were treating this as seriously as we need to treat it, if the private sector were doing, whether they were compelled to do it or not, if they're doing the right thing, that our universities, our government agencies, what would that universe look like? And Mr. Sheldon, maybe I'll start with you if you don't mind. If there are others that would like to comment, that would be great too.
Thank you, Senator. I think that a serious mobilization to the scope of the threat that you've described entails, for the part of the private sector, a full and comprehensive understanding of what's at stake. And I think that from a response standpoint, that means having really robust internal security programs so that there's someone at every company, whether it's small or large, really meaningfully looking at risk. It could be risk of insiders. It should definitely be risk of cyber threats. And then broader threats like what sort of partnerships are companies engaged in, where are they locating manufacturing facilities, who are they partnering with, and so on. And it involves integrating continual guidance from government organizations that are using their sources and means to be able to inform how that threat will change over time. The threats do change because from time to time organizations in the government will actually flag, this is a new research priority for us, or this is a new development priority for us. And then later on, that will materialize as new intelligence tasking orders for state intelligence services. So it's important to have inputs from government organizations that are looking at that. It's important to have inputs from private sector and research organizations that are looking at it from their own vantage. Cybersecurity companies, for example, are on the front lines in terms of understanding different campaigns targeting specific sensitive technologies. We do our best to work with organizations like JCDC at CISA to be able to share information about that. And there's a lot more work that we all can do as a community to make sure that when we identify threats, we can share those, and then companies are positioned, because of having a robust internal security program, to be able to action those. Thank you.
I've got a minute left if somebody wants to take it, or I'll give it back to, yes.
Senator Bennett, I think you bring up an interesting dilemma culturally for our nation. I think when you look at three things I could describe with your question. Culturally, we don't have an adversarial view of the Communist Party of China, which is like we have in Russia and Iran. We have a history, the Cold War and the Ayatollah and the hostage-taking in 1979. We have that view. We don't have that from the Communist Party of China. Secondarily, we grew up in this great country where we have clear bifurcation between the government, the private sector, and the criminal element. That's not the case in the Communist Party of China. They're all together. Same thing with Iran and Russia. So from a paradigm perspective, we don't learn that in school. And when we find out about that, it's too late. We're usually a victim of a U.S. company or institution. So culturally, we have a lot to do understanding those countries and how they operate different from us as a democracy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the senator from Oregon for your
And if the senator, as I go to the senator from Oregon, Ron, if we can go from you, okay, well, Marco's back.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good to see all of you. And I'm going to start with the export of Americans' private data to our adversaries, because my view is this poses a serious counterintelligence risk. This data alone, or in combination with data stolen through major cybersecurity breaches, threatens national security and certainly the privacy of millions of Americans. Now, there is currently before the Senate bipartisan legislation to ensure that Americans' most private data cannot be sold off in bulk to countries that would use it against us. So my first question, and I'd really like a yes or no answer, Mr. Evanina and Ms. Van Cleave, should our adversaries be able to legally purchase bulk data about Americans, their web browsing activities, their location data, and other sensitive data? Mr. Evanina.
No.
Ms. Van Cleave.
No.
Very good. Now, my second question deals with cyber threats. The Chinese government, or cyber actors based in China, have hacked into Equifax and Marriott, and Anthem, and OPM. My view is part of our response could be using the Federal Trade Commission, which is in a position to hold companies accountable for weak cybersecurity and also send a very strong signal to other companies that baseline security, along the lines of what this agency is saying, needs to be adopted. But as far as I can tell, the government doesn't really look to the Federal Trade Commission and the authorities that it has to beef up cybersecurity. Mr. Evanina, when you headed the NCSC, did you and your staff regularly talk to the Federal Trade Commission, warn them about specific industries and firms that were vulnerable to, for example, hacking?
Yes, Senator Wyden, we did, as well as other regulatory agencies in this space.
Good. Ms. Van Cleave, same question.
Senator, when I was in that job, we didn't have a security portfolio. We were responsible only, quote unquote, for counterintelligence, which meant that, no, we didn't have interaction with organizations like the FTC.
Do you wish you had that authority?
Well, I don't know. I think that the responsibilities for security and for enhancing our security across legal and other measures are broader than one organization alone. And I have to say, contrary to people who look at a job and want to build the empire larger, I thought I had my hands full as it was, taking on the CI mission, and I looked to others to handle the security responsibilities.
No, I get your point. It's just that if you have a sister agency that can hold companies accountable, which is one of the charges of the FTC, I'd like to see us use it. One last question, if I might, for you. Mr. Sheldon, you've expressed concern about requirements to provide non-public encryption information to governments and about the governmental imposition of, quote, excessive lawful access requirements. And you characterize this, I gather, as, quote, a form of mandated vulnerability by coercion. And you focused, of course, on the People's Republic of China. Now, is it correct to say that requirements by any government, including our own, to impose vulnerabilities in encryption are a threat in our ability to defend ourselves from sophisticated adversaries who are looking to exploit those vulnerabilities?
Thank you, Senator Wyden. The statement in my written testimony that you're referring to was directed at foreign adversaries. I've spent less time looking at this issue on the U.S. side.
Okay. Again, I would say that requirements by any government to impose vulnerabilities in encryption, I think, make our country less strong. You know, there's been all this debate about encryption, and is it for security or is it for liberty? You know, the fact is we are safer with strong encryption. And it is, I think, a tool that has to be an imperative for America's security future. Thank you all for being with us. Mr. Evanina, I'm just going to close with one last point. Because I asked the staff about it, we were looking for your responses to the questions for the record that we sent after a previous appearance. If there's any way that you can do it, this is not to give you a hard time or anything. I'd like to see those answers because I respect your opinion. All right. I think the Vice Chairman is here. He's going to run.
Thank you. Senator.
Thank you, Senator Rubio. Let's talk a little about campus security and research security on campuses largely, I think. Dr. Mosh, you have the professional designation on security, and you're the representative of an academic institution here. What are the best and worst practices you've seen from the federal government trying to be helpful, or on the best practices side, I guess it would be being helpful? Give me some of the things you've seen that you thought were the least effective and most effective.
In terms of awareness, I think some of the things that are least effective happen when government agencies try to do a search and replace with industry for academia. I think a lot of things that we see from the government in academia don't reflect a real understanding of the academic culture. And, we are the greatest we have the greatest higher education system in the world for a number of reasons. We've got an open and collaborative environment. We have a willingness to collaborate internationally. We have a desire to push science and the creation of knowledge as far as we can. We have cutting-edge technology. That is all very, very important to our standing as the best in the world. And I don't think what we see coming from the federal government all the time reflects an understanding of what makes us strong. And I would hate to see a mandate break the system, for lack of a better word, trying to fix it.
Mm-hmm. What about the best thing you've seen, the most helpful thing?
You know, what I have seen over the last 5 years is kind of a mind shift from a number of agencies who have really tried and worked hard to understand what the academic community is all about. And you know, I'll single the FBI out in particular. I think they have worked very hard with us to understand academia. Recently, the Department of Commerce has reached out to do the same thing. Academia created a group back in 2017 called the Academic Security and Counter-Exploitation Program. We have about 200 universities involved in that right now. We have 10 major universities on our executive committee, and we've got 6 government agencies that are involved in that as well. So, you know, I think that collaborative effort between academia and the federal government down at the grassroots level is really paying dividends in terms of awareness.
So both of those sort of reflect the same thing, and it's understanding culture
Right.
before you decide how you're really going to effectively deal with the institution.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Both Mr. Evanina and Mr. Sheldon, what are your thoughts about how we get people that are in the non-government sector who are targets to recognize the fact that they're targets? What are some of the things you'd suggest we do a better job of helping targets know they could be targets, or maybe that they already are targets and haven't determined that yet? Ms. Sheldon?
Yep. Thank you, Senator. I think that a lot of people who are being heavily targeted right now know that they're being heavily targeted. They're investing in security programs to try and stop it. I think that there's still work to be done to make sure that everyone who's being targeted has a clearer sense of that. And I think that to the extent that we, either in industry or folks in government, can provide real actionable advisories about when adversaries shift that targeting or where a new priority emerges, that is attention-getting. And I think that there's examples of times where we in industry have published white papers or blog posts that said some specific type of technology, it might be additive manufacturing, it might be satellite communications, it might be any number of other specific things, is being targeted by a specific campaign of threat actors, maybe from China, maybe from Russia. That tends to get attention and drive action, but it has to be very specific. There is a little bit of an alert fatigue at this juncture here where we stand in 2022, where people have been told that they need to be concerned about cyber for a long period of time. So if we don't get really targeted messages to people that apply to them, they may find themselves ignoring it. But if you name a specific technology that a small company is working on researching and they just invested a lot of effort and a lot of resources in bringing that to market, and you're able to point to that, that tends to catalyze action. So government and industry can both make progress there.
Thank you. Mr. Evanina, do you have anything you'd add to that?
Just to amplify outreach at scale, with, I think, a true public-private partnership between the government and a private sector consortium to advise and inform companies, large and small, to the small-time manufacturer in Kansas, to Microsoft and Google, what those threats are. That's scalable as well. Where do you find that direct information that's not only real-time but actionable for small companies and medium-sized companies? And as we've seen in the last few years, every company is vulnerable and every company will be penetrated.
But Mr. Sheldon's concept that if you know there's something out there that our adversaries are really interested in, to let people who are working in that area know that? Is that something we're doing effectively?
Yes, Senator Blunt. I think, as I wrote also in my statement for the record, the government, the big government, with quotes, must be more effective and efficient at notifying industry of those threats when we see them in a classified manner. The more effective way to declassify in real time, to be able to provide that industry or that specific company, similar to what we do in terrorism, needs to transition here at the nation-state threat actors as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman.
Senator Casey?
Thanks very much. I want to thank the panel for your testimony and your presence here today. And Mr. Evanina, I have to point out your roots in northeastern Pennsylvania, Peckville, Pennsylvania. We share the same home county, Lackawanna County, so I want to note that for the record, and thanks for your service and the work of everyone on the panel. I wanted to start with legislation that I've worked on with Senator Cornyn. The two of us have been leading this legislation in the Senate for a good while now. Senator Rubio and others have worked with us on this, and it's a piece of legislation called the National Critical Capabilities Defense Act. What we're trying to achieve with this legislation is to have an outbound review of investments so that we can focus on either services or assets that are vital to the United States national security, whether it's agricultural security, health security, homeland security, energy, infrastructure, natural resources, it goes on and on. And we haven't been successful at getting it enacted into law yet, but we're getting close, or at least a version of it. And I guess one question I have in light of the discussion is whether or not, and I'll start with you, to the former director, could NCSC or the IC more broadly help to educate the private sector with regard to the risks of outbound investment, especially when it comes to China or other foreign adversaries? Do you think there's a role for either the IC more broadly or NCSC, and especially in the early stages of technology development?
Senator Casey, thanks for the question, and pleasure to share our home county. The answer is yes, and I do believe there's success currently the way it's done in the intelligence community on CFIUS, and the way that the intelligence community partners with Treasury and Commerce and others to identify potential investments in the United States. And I do think this legislation kind of reverses that to say the same type of vulnerability and threats to national security occur outbound, especially investment in Asia, China, and other entities that have vulnerability. So I do think there's a role for the government to play in that space, specifically whether it's NCSC or the ODNI, but for sure the intelligence community with real-time threat indications and warning can certainly advise and inform an investor of the perils of investing overseas.
Anyone else in the panel on this question in terms of a perspective on it? Let me move to my second question. I think it'll be my only other question, which is, in terms of all the challenges you've outlined in your testimony to society more broadly, whether it's the academic community, academia itself, or the private sector, I want to put the ball back in the court of Congress now and ask you, what other incentives or resources do you think Congress can provide to help these non-IC entities to better protect their, whether it's intellectual property or research or technology or otherwise? Maybe Mr. Shelton, we can start with you and go right to left.
Great. Thank you, Senator. I want to flag a couple things that I think we're doing well. So I mentioned this previously, but I think we're doing a good job as a community really raising awareness, so that's helpful. And I think there's been some new structures that have come up in government now to help with collaboration and coordination, in particular on cyber threats. So I think that we're making progress there. Further, I could say I think there's also some new requirements either from the SEC or on incident reporting through CISA that are going to really force companies to be more forthcoming if there's been issues that might be important for national security to disclose information about those. And that should help organizations like the SEC and CISA provide good information and advisories to the full community. I think it's now likely time to start the conversation about like what extra resources can we bring to bear to actually provide cybersecurity capabilities to companies that need it and can't get it for whatever reason. Normally that's because of resource constraints. So I've mentioned a couple things in my written testimony that I think are worth, like topics that are worth exploring. One of those is trying to look at tax mechanisms to try and understand if there's a way that we can get small businesses in particular technologies like managed security services so that they can actually meet the threats that they face. And another one would be just having a program that could create more incident response capacity. So if there is an issue of some kind, that we as a nation have enough resources standing by to be able to meet those threats. Thank you.
I would like to echo the theme of resources. We have a staff within the A&M system of 19 that are looking solely at the research security effort and the cyber piece that goes with that. That's all being taken out of Hyde because we believe it's important. But as we get more and more requirements like NIST 800-171 and what's coming down now with NSPM 33, we're a well-resourced university system. Smaller colleges have the same requirement to protect that information, but can't make the same business case that we can. And I think that needs to be taken into consideration.
Senator, I think that there are a lot of new creative solutions with respect to security, where there's a lot of work being done in the private sector and in government that needs to continue. For example, within the Defense Department, there's a program called Deliver Uncompromised, which looks to all of the providers, for the contractors for DoD, to come look at security as an objective to be achieved rather than a cost to be minimized. And so when you start having practices like that, I think you're going to improve things overall. But I would note that one can continue down the road of security as we must, to improve it as we must, to come up with better ideas as we must, and yet there will always be a determined adversary looking for ways to break through. So if you ask, what is it that Congress can help do? Congress can help refocus on the core counterintelligence mission that says the role of the U.S. government, in addition to advising business, industry, and academia and all the things it needs to do to protect itself against, the role of government uniquely that we can't ask Texas A&M to do, and we can't ask CrowdStrike to do, is to go after the bad guys. And we are failing in that mission right now, in my opinion, sir.
Thank you.
Well, let me pick up on this. I've got a couple more questions. Notion of responsibilities. I mean, I appreciate Dr. Gamache, and we are saying that correctly, right? I want to make sure that we've not all completely butchered your name for 2 hours here, but
Yes, you are.
thank you. On this cascading issue from large systems like Texas A&M to a smaller liberal arts college, we see it in the cyberspace as well, from incident reporting, or one of the areas that this committee again wrestled with, and we all said, you got to have at least de minimis cyber standards within all the sensors on the Internet of Things, and trying to get people to adopt that has been, I think, a real challenge. One of the areas, and this, Senator Wyden is always keeping us on our toes on kind of privacy issues, but one of the things that I don't think we do a very good job of at all, and it's almost like not that the IC is reluctant to look, and the FBI is reluctant to look, is just looking back at the supply chain. If you look even from our defense contractors, where's, not first tier, second tier, but third tier and smaller suppliers, where some of that originates. I think, again, COVID exposed so many vulnerabilities, from Russia and China. There are some private sector companies out there doing that now, but, do we need to rethink authorities on this issue to allow the IC, in a sense, how do we grapple with it? Looking at a question like supply chain, having the IC look at an otherwise, well-functioning company, no sense of them being targeted, although we know most all these companies are, and go back in terms of their sourcing of their materials. That would make a lot of folks in the IC right now very uncomfortable. You think that's something that we ought to have a requirement, and where would you put that?
Mr. Chairman, if I might offer a perspective on that, when I was serving in the Counterintelligence office, we were assigned the responsibility of providing intelligence support to CFIUS, as CFIUS was making the decisions about what constituted a national security concern. And I will tell you that the problem is when you go to the intelligence community and you say, please show me what you've got on company X, Y, or Z, those files are not going to be very comprehensive. And that's because we haven't really looked at these targets for intelligence assessment purposes in order to be able to understand those operations. And so something there is a tug and pull on how you want to array your intelligence resources and what the priorities are, and perhaps there's an opportunity to prioritize these things a little more than we have in the
Although
past.
there's also this challenge that because we don't generally want the IC looking at obviously domestic persons, but also some domestic content, the ability to kind of go CFIUS or otherwise up the food chain. I think some of the large enterprises, even in the defense area, don't know where their third-tier suppliers are originating. I think some of these private sector companies are exposing that, or the ability, particularly of the CCP, to I think we became alerted to CCP direct investments in America. And I still remember one of our road shows in Texas, extra Dr. Gamache, where some small AI company said, well, I wondered why the Chinese VC was paying 3 times more than anyone else. And we didn't have that information. And the CCP's gotten smarter where they now may invest not through a Chinese-based entity, but through some European subsidiary of an entity, and our ability to kind of trace again up the food chain is really challenging. Bill, did you want to comment on that?
Senator, I do think that if we are going to get to a place where we could have an effective supply chain risk mitigation program, or even get to zero trust, we have to have a carve-out somewhere where the parts of it, the intelligence community can play in the space and be comfortable advising and informing U.S. industries that there is a threat or there is a vulnerability in a coding aspect or somewhere along the IT supply chain or in the procurement supply chain. It's very easy to do, just a matter to your point of the uncomfortable nature of the IC getting involved in that is natural and it's prudent. I just do think that if we're going to move in a place where we could have a protection of our supply chain, the IC is going to have to play because they have left of boom activity and intelligence collection they could share with those entities.
Yeah, and I think, again, there's both that ability to look at from a national security standpoint, some of that up the domestic supply chain in terms of origination, I think is important. I also think something we've stressed a couple of times here, I think we did, and with your help, do a good job of those classified roadshows. In many ways, they needed to be classified, though, because at just the non-classified level, if you can't share the experiences, enterprise or industry sector may not, they might say, what do you mean? If we can't give them some details. But I wonder at times if we had not initiated that, if we'd left it to I think the FBI has stepped up their ability to make those presentations. But again, I think because we took the bull by the horns or whatever the analogy is. But I'm not sure that's a systemic way to address this on informing our folks. So it leads me to the question which I would have some trepidation on, but one of the things around this whole CI mission, and I'm not sure where I'm going to start on this one, but is, do we try to look at the British model where they actually have a domestic counterintelligence entity? Now, clearly the UK has a whole different set of we have a whole set of protections, First Amendment and otherwise, that I think make our system better. But they have Scotland Yard, yet they have MI5. maybe I'll go the reverse route again this time. Is it time to look seriously at the idea of a independent counterintelligence entity in the United States?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think from my perspective, there's other folks in the panel that are better suited to address the organizational question. I just want to add quickly that for some aspects of industry, especially industry where you have international clients in business, maybe places in Europe and elsewhere, it's more straightforward to liaise for the purposes of something like JCDC with an organization that is removed somewhat from the intelligence community, because that makes everyone's customers more comfortable. So that's an important equity to protect if there's going to be a reorganization, is just to ensure that there are ways to collaborate between industry and government through more civil authorities. Thank you.
And I think, again, it's still on a work in process, but CISA, I think I was wrong that having CISA have enforcement proceedings against people who fail to incident report is the wrong approach, because CISA ought to be that friendly entity that is not in the regulatory sense. But Dr. Gamache?
I would defer on the organizational portion of that, Senator, but I believe that there has to be a way to plug academia into whatever solution you come up with.
Michelle?
Mr. Chairman, I do have some strong views on this, actually. In my view, one of the strengths of U.S. counterintelligence is the diversity of talents and skills and approaches and training represented in the very different agencies and the responsibilities that they've had across our government. There's value in having a national counterintelligence service, as most other foreign governments do have a centralized service. But I think that we have untapped potential in the fact that we've got such a tremendous variety of people and skills. The missing element is the ability for select high priority targets in a strategic way to meld those things together, those activities together, so that they can operate as one team with one plan and one goal when required. That's the missing element, in my opinion.
Bill?
Senator Warner, I'm going to wrap a few things together and go back to Dr. Gamache. First of all, I do think our higher education should be looked at as part of the national security defense program. I do think that it's worthy of putting it in a bucket with other entities we spend money to protect, number one. Number two is, if you just juxtapose what we talked about, the changing landscape of counterintelligence over the last 2 decades, I would proffer to this committee, if you look at our counterintelligence strategy now, protecting critical infrastructure, ensuring a supply chain, economic security, malign foreign influence, who has the authority legislatively to handle all those parts of the defense process? They're whack-a-mole through different organizations, and I do think that if we are going to modernize the concept and lexicon of counterintelligence, we have to look at what's being affected here in the U.S. And it comes to cybersecurity. At the end of every single breach that Mr. Sheldon talked about, there's a human being somewhere in a keyboard, whether it be in China or Russia or Iran. So that cannot be forgotten. So I think when you look at how they restructure this, we have to look at the 2002 Counterintelligence Enhancement Act did not take all these things into play. It was more spy versus spy. So I'm not sure an MI5, MI6 model is required. I do think we have existing structures that are probably predicated in 1980s mindset, but I do think we have to find the way to fill in the gray space to protect where that battle space is now in the private sector.
Yeah, I would, one of the things we want to try to do is solicit input, but I start with for a variety of reasons, prejudice against a new entity. And I am very conscious, we think about some of the prominent American companies is when we got into AI, and sometimes their reluctance to work with the community. But I do think this notion if I think many of the members of this committee believe that this is such a technology competition now, beyond the traditional mill-to-mill, and identifying that technology, where we're going to go deep. I think we have done a little bit on the 5G piece and the chips piece. The committee, in a bipartisan way, has agreed to look at synthetic biology and bioprocessing, series areas there, and things around advanced energy. to think about those, because they would not have been in the category of a traditional national security, counterespionage, intel agenda 10 years ago, maybe not even 5 years ago, but I think clearly are now. So this has been
Mr. Chairman, if I might
Yes,
just to interject in before this comes to a close, and thanking you again for your leadership and for your decision to hold this hearing and the subsequent hearings that you are planning on counterintelligence. There is one point that I believe I would be remiss if I didn't speak to the record on this point, and that is that I want to assure you, sadly, and the committee, that traditional espionage is still ongoing. It is still directed against us. It is still very much a threat to our national security, to the secrets that are most important to our national security, to people and treasure who work with our intelligence community, to our troops in the field. These kinds of penetrations into the U.S. government that are traditional espionage, it is very much ongoing. It is very much the focus of our adversary, and I would urge, as the committee moves forward, to keep your eye on that as well.
Well, we are very aware, and this kind of open setting is not the place to go into that. But even in terms of some of our near-peer competitors, just the number of people they have in country under some level of traditional diplomatic status, whether their embassy or through the UN, is a huge issue. It is not an either-or proposition. I know there are a number of other members, but with the vote schedule, sometimes it is hodgepodge. But I very much appreciate everybody's presentation, and obviously we've got some more work to do. Committee's adjourned. Thank you all.